Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is December 8th. On this night in 1980, 40-year-old John Lennon, one of the most famous musicians in the world, was gunned down outside of his apartment building as he returned from the recording studio with his wife, Yoko Ono. Just hours earlier, he signed an autograph for the man who would pull the trigger. Within minutes, Lennon was gone, and the world would wake up to the impossible news that one of the Beatles was dead, shot in the back at close range by a fan-turned-killer. Today, we're talking about the murder of John Lennon. Let's get started. By late 1980, John Lennon was in the middle of a personal and creative rebirth. After stepping away from the music industry to raise his son Sean, he had spent 5 years largely out of the spotlight. He lived quietly with Yoko Ono at the Dakota, a historic New York City apartment building overlooking Central Park. But that fall, Lennon was beginning to reemerge. In November, he and Yoko released Double Fantasy, a joint album that reflected their relationship, their life in New York, and their shared dreams. Lennon was working on new songs and was talking about touring again. December 8th, 1980 was a full day. Lennon and Ono did a photo shoot with Annie Leibovitz in the morning and then headed to the record plant studio to work on Walking on Thin Ice, a song that Ono had written and Lennon was producing. They stayed until late evening, finalizing a mix that Lennon carried home on cassette, the same tape that would later fall from his hand onto the pavement. Standing outside of the Dakota for most of that day was 25-year-old Mark David Chapman. Born in Texas and living in Hawaii, Chapman had grown up idolizing the Beatles. But by 1980, his admiration for Lennon had turned into something more sinister. Chapman had undergone a religious conversion and became obsessed with the idea that Lennon was a hypocrite. He was especially offended by the song Imagine and Lennon's more popular than Jesus comment from the 60s. He believed that Lennon preached peace and anti-materialism while living a wealthy life. Chapman also identified with Holden Caulfield, the disillusioned teen from The Catcher in the Rye. He saw Lennon as a phony and saw himself as someone who was meant to stop him. Chapman first traveled to New York that October with the intention of killing Lennon, but he backed out. He returned home, told his wife about his disturbing thoughts, and even considered seeking help. But instead, on December 6th, he flew back to New York City, bringing with him a revolver, hollow point bullets, and his dog-eared copy of The Catcher in the Rye, inside of which he scrawled, quote, "This is my statement," end quote. By the morning of December 8th, he had made up his mind. Chapman spent the day watching people come and go. At around 5 p.m., Lennon and Ono left the Dakota for the studio. A small crowd had gathered. Chapman held out a copy of Double Fantasy and asked for an autograph. Lennon obliged, and a photographer captured the moment, John, pen in hand, signing the album while Chapman looked on. Chapman later said that Lennon was kind and gracious and even asked him if he needed anything else. Despite already having the gun with him, Chapman didn't act. Instead, he let Lennon leave. But he didn't go away. Around 10:50 p.m., Lennon and Ono returned home in their limousine. Rather than pulling into the courtyard, the car stopped on the street. Yoko stepped out first, with John just behind her. As they walked toward the archway entrance, they passed Chapman, who was still standing near the sidewalk. John glanced at him, appearing to recognize him from their earlier interaction. But this time, Chapman wasn't looking for an autograph. As John Lennon walked by him, he pulled the revolver from his coat and fired 5 hollow point bullets into John Lennon's back. 4 hit him, 2 in the back and 2 in the shoulder. 1 missed and struck a window in the Dakota. Lennon stumbled up the steps, bleeding heavily, and managed to say, I'm shot, before collapsing inside of the lobby. Outside, the doorman, Jose Perdomo, shouted at Chapman and knocked the gun from his hand. Chapman calmly removed his coat, revealed that he had no other weapons, and began reading The Catcher in the Rye. When police arrived minutes later, Chapman offered no resistance. He simply said, I just shot John Lennon. Officers decided not to wait for an ambulance. They loaded Lennon into the back seat of a patrol car and rushed him to Roosevelt Hospital. At Roosevelt Hospital, doctors and nurses worked frantically trying to save Lennon's life. But the wounds were too severe. He had lost more than 80% of his blood, and major arteries near his heart and lungs were destroyed. He was pronounced dead at around 11:15 p.m. Outside, word began to spread. The news broke during Monday Night Football when sportscaster Howard Cosell interrupted the game to deliver the stunning update. John Lennon has been shot and killed in New York City. Overnight, crowds gathered outside of the Dakota. Fans brought flowers, candles, and guitars. Strangers sang Beatles songs in the cold December air. Radio stations across the globe played his music on repeat. People cried. They didn't want to believe it. The next day, Yoko Ono issued a statement. There would be no funeral, she said. Instead, she asked people to pause for a moment of silence, wherever they were, to remember John. On December 14th, 1980, millions of people across the world stopped what they were doing for 10 minutes of silence. In Central Park, thousands stood shoulder to shoulder in tribute. John Lennon was cremated. His ashes were not publicly scattered or buried. Mark David Chapman was charged with second-degree murder and later pleaded guilty. He told the court that he believed it was the will of God, though he also admitted craving fame. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison and has been denied parole at every hearing since 2000. Yoko Ono has strongly opposed his release, citing the pain his actions caused and her ongoing concerns for her family's safety. In 1985, a section of Central Park directly across from the Dakota was transformed into strawberry fields, a peaceful memorial garden funded in part by Ono. Its centerpiece is a mosaic that reads, Imagine. Every December 8th, fans gather there. Some old enough to remember where they were when they heard the news, others who were born long after Lennon's death. On that cold night in 1980, John Lennon was a husband coming home from work. He was carrying cassette tapes and dreaming of the future. But a man with a gun and a need to be seen ended that future in seconds. Despite this, Lennon's music, his voice, and his message haven't been silenced. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe, and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!